Hello, everyone. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
So wonderful to see you again after 5 years, only 5 years. I'd like to, I see that people are still coming in, so maybe one more minute. We'll see if there is anyone else who is waiting. So, okay, we probably can start.
Okay.
So today we have a conversation with Peter Franz, translator of poets of Golden Age and French poets, Russian poets of Golden Age and French poets and Chuvash poetry and Mandelstam and whatnot. But today we'll concentrate on just a few themes. We decided, Peter and I decided that we'll focus on the Golden Age poets. And I'd like, it was my request to talk a little bit more about Baratynsky. And we will, of course, talk a little bit about collaboration in translation, which is our underlying theme through our series. It just so happens that everybody is talking about that. It seems to be something that is very, very contemporary these days. So Peter, welcome to the Movable studio.
Yeah.
Art of Translation, and our first question is always it's a very plain question, but I think it's necessary. How did it happen that you came to translation? How did it happen that you started learning Russian and translating from Russian?
Well, it goes a long way back. When I was 17, I had to join the Royal Air Force, do my national service, 2 years of national service. And this was in the height of the Cold War, of course. And luckily, they thought fit to send me on a Russian course to learn Russian for all sorts of non-literary reasons, which I won't go into now. But we had to spend 18 months doing nothing but learning Russian. So I learned all sorts of things about airplanes and so on. We didn't read any poetry, but we got quite a good grounding in Russian. And we did read novels in order to extract as much vocabulary from them as possible. They weren't very good novels on the whole. But thereafter, I was able to go on to Oxford and do a degree in French and Russian. And I concentrated on French afterwards. My work in my career was teaching French literature and language, literature mainly. And I carried on with that until 2000. But I'd kept up with the Russian, and I had a very good friend who was at college with me, a poet called Jon Stallworthy, and he had been put on to the poetry of Blok by his supervisor, Maurice Bowrer, and got very keen on Blok and did a translation of the 12, Gennady, with Max Haywood, very good translation. And then Max sort of didn't want to do any more because he was doing other things. So Jon asked me to collaborate with him, and I collaborated with him on a volume of Blok's lyric poetry, and then on a volume of Pasternak's lyric poetry. These were translations, not dual bilingual, just single language. And at that time, I was therefore working with Jon, but I was the one who knew Russian, and he was the poet, if you like. And we worked very close together. After that, and when I was doing the Pasternak, I wanted to find out more about Pasternak, so I went to Moscow, and this was my second visit to Moscow in 1974, and I was directed to a poet, a Chuvash poet, Gennady Augi, whom I'd never heard of, and I'd never read any of his poems. And I went to see him to talk about Pasternak, whom we'd known. And I discovered that he was a poet too. And he gave me some of his poems, and I brought them home to England with me. I was living in England at the time, and started translating them by myself in this case, not with Jon, really because I wanted to continue a sort of conversation with him, to be with him and to understand what he was doing in poetry. And that's how I got into translation, really, in the full sense of the word of poetry, although before that I had done a certain amount of prose translation. But my first real poetic translation was through Aygi.
So it started because for some reason I thought that it started with the Golden Age, but it did not.
No, far from it. I can come to that later if you want, but I mean, what happened was that I worked with Aygi, on Aygi, and I did a total of about 6 or 7 volumes of his poetry in English, including through his good offices, the Chuvash anthology of Chuvash poetry, which you mentioned. And it was only really later on that I got onto Golden Age poetry. I'd written a book which is called Poets of Modern Russia in 1982. And for that, I did quite a lot of translations. And that had a first chapter, which was a sort of preliminary chapter, introductory, in which there were some poems by Pushkin and Lermontov, which were possibly Tyutchev, I can't remember, which I had to translate for that. So that was when I first did that. But it was really only when I'd retired from teaching French that I became more and more interested in Russian poetry, the whole sweep of Russian poetry, and started looking back more and more to the poets of Pushkin's time, really.
Let's talk a little bit about Batyushkov, shall we? I have this book that your publisher kindly sent to me a while ago. It's a wonderful book. So it's this is Batyushkov. This is, I guess, it's a whole series. It looks like it's a series.
It's from the Columbia Russian Library, yes.
So this is Batyushkov, and I want to say that I really, really like your forewords. All your forewords are so precise, so clear-sighted. So they're just like navigators. For example, this I looked last night. I looked at the foreword for in the Batyushkov book, and it starts you precisely pinpointing the position of this poet in many ways, in terms of tonality, in terms of age, in many ways, and it's like coordinates, which I love because it's you never overdoing it. You don't bring along some arbitrary parallels, or so to speak, but it's always very. I think it's very clear, and it's very necessary for a foreign reader, I think. Гуляка с волшебной тростью Batyushkov. Can you say a few words about translating him, and also about the book itself? Is a rather interesting composition of this book, because it's not an article and then poems. It's a combination of a biographical writing with poetry that is just an integral part of it. And it's just from the first page to the last. It's biography and poetry, biography and poetry.
Well, that's a fairly unusual format, I think. And some people have said I should have just done an essay on Batyushkov followed by poems, but I preferred that way, partly because Batyushkov's life is so interesting and the relation of the poems to the life. In fact, the best poems come at the end of the book, unfortunately, because he got better as he went on. So it would have been in some ways nicer to have begun with some of the really great poems, which tend to come in the second half of the book. But that being said, I really enjoyed. It's not a full-scale biography. I'm much dependent on Russian writers who've written about Batyushkov's life. So it's just bringing that over to English-speaking readers. And I don't know, I felt it worked quite well to have a mix of prose and verse in that way. and not to sort of put the poems at the end as if they were a sort of appendix, or else to have the biography as just an introduction, but just a very brief introduction to the poems. I wanted the two to have a sort of equivalence, if you like, the life and the poetry.
I think it works very well, specifically for Batyushkov, because this whole character and his whole nature, about which he wrote in his Чужое мое сокровище, in his notebooks, is so double-faced, is so dual, right? Yeah. We have the dark side and the light side of himself, which he so he understood it so clearly himself. So this is a tragic life that is not just a biography. This is the material and the medium in which he wrote, and he made this word the medium, which influenced, of course, not only Pushkin, but the 20th century, Mandelstam, of course. We wouldn't probably have Mandelstam not only without Tuchev, but maybe even more importantly, without Batyushkov, who forged this medium, right? And forged the word and the whole idea of, which is so opposite to Zhukovsky, of course. Allegedly with the Golden Age.
I mean, it's obviously partly because of Mandelstam's writing about Batyushkov, and also because of two poems that Aygi wrote about Batyushkov, which struck me very much. Partly because of that I did the book at all. I mean, I came to Batyushkov by chance long ago in the Dmitry Obolensky's anthology, bilingual anthology of with prose translations of Russian poetry. And at the time, and that was one of my earliest translations of Golden Age poetry, I was so taken by Tien Druga, the shadow of a friend, that I translated that to try and get something of the feel of it and to sort of immerse myself in the music of it and the vision of it. And so I'd got that one poem translated, and then I'd been doing work on Baratynsky in particular, and more, but Batyushkov came to seem an important figure who was pretty well totally unknown in English, I think, except for people who are studying Russian literature. And even among them, he's probably not terribly well known, I suspect. He tends to be always in a sort of footnote saying, before Pushkin there was Dzержavin, then there was Batyushkov and Zhukovsky, and then Pushkin took it all over, and so on. Whereas Batyushkov, I think, deserves to be more than a footnote. He's a very significant figure.
He's the giant. He is not even a giant. He's the giant, I think. Let's talk about Baratynsky a little bit, and Batyushkov will certainly come up when we start talking about Mandelstam. So Baratynsky, I have this book of yours. Again, thank you. And this book is composed differently. It's more traditional format. It's the essay, which I really love, and poetry. And it's half-light, Sumerki. So Baratynsky is, I think it's always intriguing, a life that is too late or too early. A life of a poet who is too late or too early is always so intriguing to me, at least. Of course, I cannot but think about Hopkins in this sense, but even Sumerki in Russian is before sunrise and also after sunset. Dusk, twilight is pretty much after sunset light, yes. And Baratynsky was Sumerki in the Russian sense, because he was a predecessor. He was much earlier than those who would value him so much later, including the 20th century. And he certainly was out of fashion in the in the early 40s already, he was completely irrelevant in a way. And I think that these are the most precious voices, the ones who are not relevant, are always so interesting, and they're always innovators. So when I was reading your foreword last night, I noticed two things that I think are certainly were novel. You write about his travel to Paris when he's self-translating, which is also interesting, right? When we talk about translation, he was self-translating his poems into French and reading them in some gatherings, which led to, and you're saying that I hadn't known that he contributed to this whole genre of prose poetry.
Prose poetry, yeah. I must say, I'm not entirely, I don't have very strong proof of that, but I think I got the idea of that from, in fact, Aygi's French translator, Movable, who's now died, and he was the one who sort of put me onto that, but I'm not sure how solid the proof is of that, but it seems at least possible, because it fits exactly with the beginnings of what's it called, Gaspard Lagny, Tristan, yeah, I've forgotten his name, and the beginnings of Baudelaire's prose poetry, which comes a few years later. So quite possibly so. I don't think Batyushkov meant them, as far Baratynsky meant them in Paris, to be seen as poems in their own right. I think they were meant to be just enabling the French to get some idea of what his poems were really like. I don't think he was trying to invent a new genre of prose poetry.
So it just happened.
I think it's
it was a haphazard innovation. And the second novelty that I noticed is that, again, I hadn't thought about it. Maybe I knew about it, but I hadn't thought about it. That the book is a book. It's not a collection of, not this book. I'm pointing to your book, but you, of course, have more than Sumerki, and you have other poems from other books of his. But Baratynsky's Sumerki was the first, probably, book of poems, not a poetry collection. So the whole concept, which is, to me, is very important personally, and I know to many other poets, is also, it's another innovation. So this poet who is so old-fashioned suddenly comes up with ideas that are so ahead of their time, of his time. And I'd like us to speak a little bit about the principles of translating Baratynsky as you express them here. You spelled them out in this essay. I can say that I listed 5 of them that I think are most important, and I absolutely subscribe to all 5 of them. I agree with all 5 of them, and people who know me know that I don't agree that easily. I mostly disagree. I'm a no person rather than a yes person. Here I was saying yes, 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 yes. So the first one, when you're talking about the meaning, and meaning is such a meaning in poetry is such a dangerous word, but you somehow got away with it. You really spelled it out so clearly, talking about how you rendered the meaning and what it meant to their contemporaries. So the second one, I'll just list all 5, and then if you have any comments about all 5 of them, of any of the 5. So the form, in your form, you are not, as you put it, period rendering. You are not rendering the period. In other words, you are not completely replicated what it would like formally to his contemporaries, because of course it would be lost on our ears and our eyes. You didn't say that, I'm saying that, but this is what I'm assuming that the reasoning for that. Meta, of course, this painful subject for all translators. So you are your prosodic choices, your metric choices vary, And I like it so much because I don't think there is one recipe, even for one translator, to follow diligently, which never works, of course, or to just retell the story, which is not working either. So you made choices. Sometimes you sacrifice the alteration of feminine and masculine endings, but you keep close to the meter. Sometimes you do something else. So we'd like to hear from you. And the last 4 points that are maybe even most important for me are the definite quality of voice, that it was important for you that the voice that we hear is the pitch is very definite. At least this is how I understood what you're saying in your preface, the tone. And I think it's a universal principle. I think this is the first thing that we need to try to do when we translate. This voice may not be your own. Hopefully it's not, and it's not maybe something that is very close to the poet that you are translating in the original language, but it should be a definite voice, some kind of a third person, if you will. And lastly, the rhyming principle, of course, that is, you are so free with it. You're making choices based on a poem. So can you? So you're not translating the rhymes or even the rhyme scheme. You're translating the rhyming principle. Can we talk a little bit about any of these or all 5?
I think I'd rather not start with meaning, which is a rather difficult and impossible one to talk about. You do what you can. As far as meter is concerned, which is an immediate thing that you're struck with, as you say, I've not meters. I mean, what Brodsky said was, I think it's something like that. Meters are a sort of spiritual form which has to be preserved. And in a way, I mean, I could see what he's saying there, and it's certainly true that when I've been translating, for instance, recently I've been translating some French poetry and Apollinaire, and there's no way that you can translate the poem I've been doing, which is the Chanson du Mal-Aimé, which is a long poem, fairly youthful poem, in octosyllables with five-line stanzas, and it's absolutely, that's the essential to the poem, and you couldn't not do that. But not always is that the case, and sometimes a poem will seem to go better, well, thinking about rhyme, into something more like a blank verse. I mean, I couldn't give any rules on this. It's just the way it seems to work at the time. An interesting example is the poem, which is not actually in the Sumeki in the Half Light, but in the other poems. No, sorry, it's in the Half Light. So I was mixing it up. The one called The Last Poet, and there you've got a sort of 2 sets of sort of parts that alternate, and the second one I changed it from what Baratynsky did to a slightly different form, which seemed to me to work rather better as a contrast with the other one. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit vague on this, but it did seem to me that there I could do something. With rhyme, I'm not so sure. I mean, sometimes rhyme, it really is a question of what you can do. I mean, I do try and keep a rhyming principle present, at least in many of the poems, but and ideally one would rhyme more than I rhymed, I think, probably. But there's one poem which I think we're going to read, the one about thought, more thought, where it seemed to me that was fitted quite nicely into an almost unrhymed version. But even there, if you look at it, you will see there is the final line rhymes with the 4th line, so there's a distant rhyme, and there are other sort of half rhymes. So usually I work a lot with, I suppose, what are called slant rhymes, part rhymes, assonances, the sort of thing that Rupert Brooke does, where you have consonants the same but the vowels changing, as opposed to the assonance where the vowel stays and the consonant changes. all of these are ways in which you can knit the poem together, it seems to me, even without exactly replicating what is done in Russian, which is, I think there's no way, I mean, people have done this, but it
never works. No
I
matter how,
can't do it myself.
no matter
I
how,
don't like the results usually.
no matter how famous the people who proclaim this principle are and important, it never works. I'm reading in your foreword, I balk at the idea of reflecting the regular rhymes of the Russian, but have aimed to preserve the rhyming principle with a variety of slant rhymes and in English, and sometimes they're graphic rhymes. We'll read a few lines right now, and we'll see that some of them are visual graphic rhymes. Right, and of course, what's also very, I agree wholeheartedly with what you say here. The prosody has been changed, though never drastically, and always with the intention of producing the same kind of effect. I have tried to echo what I hear subjectively, no doubt, as the poet's voice, rather than the precise form that embodies it. I think that it's very well put, and I think it's very important. So let's read. We decided that we'll read this very interesting poem, and of course, rhyming. How can we not rhyme at all? Baratynsky, who wrote a poem, we know how rhyming is.
Yeah, well,
So,
I have to translate that poem, yeah.
Yeah, so let's first read. Peter and I decided that we'll read a short poem, Всё мысль да мысль. So I'll read the original. Peter will read his translation, and you can follow what he has done with this poem. Всё мысль да мысль, художник бедный слова, о жрец ее, тебе забвения нет. Все тут, да тут и человек, и свет, и смерть, и жизнь, и правда без покрова. Резец, орган, кисть. Счастлив, кто влеком к ним чувственным, за грань их не ступая. Есть хмель ему на празднике мирском, но пред тобой, как пред нагим мечом, мысль, острый луч. Бледнеет жизнь земная.
Thought, yet more thought. Poor artist of the world, thought's priest. For you there can be no forgetting. It's all here. There are people in the world and death and life and truth without a veil. Ah, chisel, shallow, brush. Happy the man drawn to you by his senses, going no further. He can drink freely at the world's great feast. But in your presence, thought, in your sharp rays, before your unsheathed sword, our life grows pale.
And we also decided that actually I first met Peter virtually. Remember when we published the Cardinal Points, published your translations of Autumn by Pushkin and Autumn by Baratynsky, and your essay about it in our Cardinal Points a long time ago. And that was the first time that I actually saw your translation. Today is, by the way, Oleg's birthday, December 3rd, so, and we're remembering the beginning of Cardinal. So we decided, Peter and I decided, that we'll just read two stanzas from Autumn, one of the masterpieces of Baratynsky. And stanza 15 is, as it is well known or believed, that there is an allusion to Pushkin's death, because as he was writing this poem, for a long time, Pushkin's death occurred right when he was nearing the end of the poem, composing the poem. And despite what Brusov said about the preceding stanza, that he is kind of actually slandering Pushkin, partially Glassky, Brusov thought, I don't know if you read anything about that. I read some time ago that Brusov thought that Baratynsky actually was making fun of Pushkin, which I don't think is true, but maybe Brusov could do that, but not Baratynsky. Anyway, yes. So we'll read this 15th stanza and the final 16, this magnificent 16th stanza of Autumn. Пускай, приняв неправильный полет, и вспять стези не обретая, звезда небес в бездонность утечет. Пусть заменит ее другая. Не яствует земле ущерб одной, не поражает ухо мира падение ее далекий вой, равно как в высотах эфира ее сестры новорожденный свет и небесам восторженный привет. Зима идет, и тощая земля в широких лысинах бессилия, и радостно блиставшие поля золотыми классами обилья, со смертью жизнь, богатство с нищетой, все образы годины бывшей сравняются под снежной пеленой, однообразно их покрывшей. Перед тобой таков отныне свет, но в нем тебе грядущей жатвы нет.
This one I have tried to keep a bit closer to the actual form, particularly the alternation of what in Russian seen as masculine and feminine endings, which is rather an unusual principle in English, but it seemed to me a good idea here. What if a star from heaven disappears into the chasm of nothing, missing its way and never finds its place again? Another one replaces it unheeded. One star the less is nothing to the earth. Our people are too hard of hearing to spot the distant howling of its death, or the brightness of a star appearing, newborn, amid the sisters of the sky, and greeting them with rapturous melody. Winter draws on, and over the sick earth impotence stretches with a shiver, and furrows overflow with golden ears, and all the cornfields gaily glitter. Life and death, want and wealth lie side by side, and all the variety of the year now vanished is equalized beneath the snowy shroud that hides it in indifferent sameness. Thus all things will appear to you henceforth, but you will reap no harvest from the earth.
Yeah, that's the rhyming of death and the earth, right? I have a little surprise for you. It will sound like a daytime television, but I hope Ilya is here and he will, Ilya Kutik is here and he will.
Oh,
yeah, that was a little, present for you. And I really like what Ilya says about Baratynsky. I think it is very eloquent and it is very true. And you close your foreword with his statement. As a poet, Baratynsky was neither a philosopher nor a thinker. He was a fearless, dispassionate spectator of himself and his actions seen in an epic light. I think every word is very true and epic, and certainly light. Light. Despite the Pushkin's word, he is an exception among us because he thinks. Mm-hmm. He does think, but it's not a philosopher poet, something very cerebral and philosopher poet.
Can I say thank you to Ilya if he's there, and say how much I owe to him, because what happened in this was I actually met Ilya for the first time long ago in Moscow, and he translated a poem that I'd written, which I don't write that many poems myself. I do more translation, but and then it turned out that he was, when I started working on Baratynsky, thought of actually making a collection. I found that he was actually involved with something rather similar, and with somebody else, and we got together. Well, we got together on the distance, And he helped me greatly in my understanding of Baratynsky and wrote some splendid essays on the poems, which don't figure in this volume that we've been looking at today, but they figure in a journal called Fulcrum. I don't know how often people read Fulcrum, but this was some years ago now, and there is the translations on many of the translations from Half-Lighter in that, together with Ilya's very good commentaries on them. So thank you, Ilya.
Ilya, you'll get a chance to hear his voice. I hope Ilya is here, and you will at the end we will have some little exchange. Now we'll just we decided that we'll talk at length about Baratynsky. Now just a few words about the remaining poets that I just like to at least hear a few words about your translation from Mandelstam, and specifically I know that you translated from Шум времени as well. So it's, to me, it's very interesting how different it is, the way you translate his prose, Mandelstam's prose, and poetry. So this, I have Black Earth, your Black Earth, thank you. It came out recently. It's New Directions, right? Yeah, it's New Directions edition. And there are essays as well. Most of it is poetry, but there is also Mandelstam's essay. Just if you could say a few words. So we going back from Batyushkov again to Mandelstam.
Well, my sort of relation with Mandelstam go back quite a long way, and it's quite difficult in a way because I was translating with Jon Stallworthy long ago, Pasternak, for instance, and Mandelstam obviously sort of crossed my path a good deal at that time, and I then started getting very interested in Mandelstam, and I remember spending a long time trying to understand the Irina Augi, which is a very difficult poem, and I found him difficult. And then more and more as I read him, I thought, this is the great poet. I'm not the only one that thinks that, obviously. And I was sort of, in a way, scared of him, I suppose, because I felt that this was just too great for me to do anything with. It's like being unworthy to do up the latch in someone's shoe. You know, I felt unworthy to quite take on Mandelstam. But gradually I did. I wrote a chapter about him in this book about 20th century Russian poetry. And I translated a certain number of poems there, not terribly well always. I've had to redo them since when I've published those translations. And so I've done quite a few, and one or two got published in various places, in journals and in anthologies. And to my great astonishment, Jeffrey Young, publisher at New Directions, said, can we do well, first he said, can we do a pamphlet? And we did a pamphlet, but it's quite a big pamphlet. It's about 70 pages. And that was fine, that was lovely. And then he said, can we now make this into a book? So I was, in a sense, forced to do this, but I wanted to do it, although it was very difficult. And I eventually even took on and tried to translate the slate, what I call the slate pencil ode, Irina Augi, some people call it slate ode, and which still remains, in spite of the explanations of Gasparov and others, and you know, lots of people have interpreted Mandelstam endlessly, and that helps you in a way when you're translating it, but you can't be too tied up with those interpretations because you've got to read it yourself and do your own work with it yourself too. So I've tried to do that with Irina Augi. As for the prose, that came later really, and I always liked Mandelstam's prose, and I've translated prose in the past from various people. But it did seem that it would be nice to have a volume, which there are other volumes of the same sort, where the two were set one against the other. Well, not against the other, side by side and illuminating one another, I hope, because a lot of the poems relate to themes that are in the prose, and the prose refers to the poems. So there's quite a lot in common between them, and there's a certain vision of things which is possibly common between them, but obviously the big difference is that there is that fantastic music in the verse, which is a whole other thing, and that obviously is why I've found Mandelstam, I think, so difficult to try and do something with. I don't like the word music very much, but the sound, anyhow, the sound of it.
Did you go back to Batyushkov after that and do Чужое мое сокровище, any of Batyushkov's essays? Because I think there is
no. I've done the Batyushkov before. I mean, yeah, I did the Batyushkov at the same time I was doing it, and then I did the Mandelstam prose later. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Because there is some connection, right?
I suppose so. Yeah. I can see that. But in a way, it's slightly different because with Batyushkov, I wanted to have the prose because I think actually some of Batyushkov's prose is at a level with his verse, really. I don't quite think that of Mandelstam. I think with Mandelstam, the verse remains at a higher, it's just stunning, the verse, in a way that the prose is always interesting and terrific sometimes, but it's the verse that I'm really interested in.
This is the first time, and maybe the last time, I would not disagree. I would not agree with you.
Yeah. You would put them side by side, would you?
Well, in terms of the greatness of prose and poetry of Mandelstam, I don't think that.
Yeah.
I certainly don't think that prose is any less than.
No, but it's if I think of Mandelstam, what comes to mind is a certain number of great poems above all. I have to say.
Maybe at different times of our life, right? We go to this or that. You mentioned that Mandelstam, that Gennady Augi was the one who introduced Mandelstam to you, right?
No. He introduced Batyushkov.
But
Aygi was not actually terribly keen on Mandelstam.
I wonder why.
It's a different world.
Yeah.
It's a quite different world. It's a rich, powerful, sort of expansive world. Mandelstam's world Aygi's world is a world of whispering and quietness, and Mandelstam is not a quiet poet. I mean, there is quietness in some of the early poems, but he's not. I think I've described Aygi sometimes as being a poor poet, poor in the sense of not meaning a bad poet, but the poet of a sort of poverty, of not minimalist, but working with small materials. Like where Mandelstam is an imperial poet in a way.
A poet of modest means in that sense, right?
And then, in fact, it's interesting that Aygi, I don't want to have this in your discussion, but that Aygi, when he looked back to Russian poetry, of course he's not Russian, he's Chuvash, but what appealed to him most tend to be outsiders and people. Well, his great Russian poets were Lermontov, Aniensky, who I've also tried translating, Chlebnikov, Mayakovsky, that sort of line, if you like. It's a quite different line from the line there where you put Mandelstam, I think.
Tell us a little bit, just a few words, because we'd like to already go to questions. And just a few words about collaboration with living poets, and also about your collaboration with Jon Stallworthy, because you mentioned right at the very beginning that he was the one with whom you started working on translation. And I noticed, I hadn't noticed before last night, and I only noticed last night that the Baratynsky volume is dedicated to his memory, right?
Yeah.
And so talk just a few words about collaboration with translators like Jon Stallworthy and your friend, and collaborations with living poets, and how different is it from translating someone who cannot respond?
Right.
Correctly.
Well, start with Jon then. I mean, Jon was a very close friend, and we were at college together, and we worked together a great deal. And it was, as I say, it was him who brought me into the whole business of translating Russian poetry. He didn't know any Russian at all. He did go to Russia once, I think, or possibly twice, and made one or two friends there. But I had to act for him in that. The way we worked was very much so by toing and froing between one another. It wasn't that I provided him with a version, he did a translation. It's that I started with something, he sent something back, I sent something back, I read the poem out to him aloud, we met and talked about it and so on. So that we did take joint responsibility for it, though I suppose in the end it's probably he was the poetic voice in it, and you hear his voice in it more than you hear my voice in it, in the sense that I would have pushed it in different directions, I think. And that, there was a negotiation that went on, which produced the effect it produced. Some people have, that was a thing that was done very much at the time. There were a whole set of two-person work, things like that. And Elaine Feinstein's Svitaya, for instance, was based on Angela Livingston's version, but Angela didn't get very much credit, in fact, although she should have done. And there were all the famous Brown Merwin Mandelstam, which Brodsky attacked, and so on. And some people thought, well, this is not the right way to do it. It was a sort of solution of necessity when there weren't enough Russian speakers around who were poets, or weren't enough poets who were Russian speakers. It's probably not done so much now for Russian, although it still is for lots of languages. I think for Eastern languages in particular. And I've done it, of course, for Chuvash. I've had translated with Aygi for Chuvash. Aygi produced starters then, and we worked in a similar sort of way. But except that, of course, he didn't know any English, so I was left rather by myself there. If I may come on to Chuvash and to Aygi and the living poet question, how should one say? When I began, as I said, it was meant as a sort of conversation at a distance to translation of him. I didn't translate it with a view of publishing it or anything like that. I didn't have the desire to make everyone know about this poet at first. I just wanted to know what his poetry was, and to be in it, and to correspond with him, to connect with him. So when I got back from Moscow in 1974, I started translating these with some difficulty, because he's not, many Russian readers find him difficult to make sense of. I don't think he's as difficult as all that. So that was what I was doing. And so we had we were continuing correspondence, sometimes about the translations, but more often just about life. But that sort of fed into the translations, which is, that I felt that I was listening to his voice through letters from him, and then meeting him whenever I could, which was not very frequently. But he couldn't really make any comments on my translations. I could read them out to him aloud, but I don't think that was particularly helpful. it's very different from the experience of translating Brodsky, which many people have written about, and I've written a little bit about it too, and that was quite different, of course, where Brodsky took over. And it was what I did with him. I don't know if you know about this. I translated the 20 sonnets to Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, and I sent it to him at someone's suggestion, and he was at the same time both very complimentary and very uncomplimentary about what I'd done. And he said, I want to include it into Urania, his volume. So I said, well, that's fine. And he sent me back proofs in which he'd rewritten my translations. So then I had to come back, and we had a certain amount of to and fro, but on the whole, he had his way. And I was the servant there, and he was the master. But he did have the decency, I mean, it was very good of him, really, in a way, to let me publish my own translations in another volume, so that anyone who really wanted to could compare the ones done by the two of us and the ones that I'd done by myself. So that was, sorry?
This is very rare. I haven't heard any another example of such thing happening.
Well, I don't know of any, but I've never looked really very hard. I know that Brodsky's translators, you know, I remember corresponding with Alan Myers, who was a major translator of his, and he said, well, when you start translating Joseph, you put on your tin helmet and put on your armor.
And don't take it
It
off.
wasn't for the faint-hearted. He did say rather, he didn't pull his punches when he wanted to criticize you. Oh well.
Yeah, that's I never knew about this episode. It's quite something.
I must say in the end that I think people have been too rude about Brodsky's own self-translations. I think there is something, you know, the people have been very critical of them. He does. He shows what you can do with a rhyme. Rhyme, I think, was essential for him, really more than meter in a way almost. And he does things there that I wouldn't have dared to do. And I think he teaches you the thing that translators lack, poetry translators, I think prose translators too, often lack is audacity. And translating Brodsky suggested that you could be more audacious. You could chance your arm a bit more. And I think that's an important lesson.
And English poems as well, the original poems as well, teach you audacity. I wish you were here, dear. I wish you were here. I think it's quite audacious in a way that is so simple.
Yeah, because after all, you can write poems not in your own language. I mean, after all, Aygi wrote poems not in his own language, and many Russians actually said as much, you know, and said he doesn't know Russian properly. But you can do a lot, and I've seen translations, self-translations that are by, I think it was Yves Bonnefoy, the French poet, which were really very interesting to read. You know, they did surprising things.
Self-translations.
But I've never tried it myself.
So Peter, I think that we want to, if Ilya is Ilya here, Roman, can you please turn on microphone?
So okay, Ilya, no, I don't think so. Maybe we had more people who came in and left, but we have so far like 6-7 people.
And two of them are Peter and I, and the third.
Yeah, I don't see Ilya. I see Mikhail and I see, but Ilya I don't see.
Okay. I see. Shan is here. Hi, Shan. So okay, so Ilya is not here. So I didn't work as, you know, there was in the Soviet times there was this TV program where there was this famous TV host who was also a host for little children's programs. her name was Tетя Валя, Valentina Leontieva. She had this very tearful program where she would bring together people who hadn't seen each other for years, and they will weep, and everyone would weep. Then here to
That
States,
would have been nice, yeah.
it's just this.
I would have wept.
Well, yeah, it wasn't my intention, but when I came here, I realized that it was actually something that's stolen from the American TV, that it's just such a cliche on the American TV. There are many programs like that. So I was a little bit channeling Tетю Валю right now, but I didn't succeed, unfortunately. But I'm sure that you'll reconnect with Ilya soon. So if there is any question from anyone, we would be happy to.
So I'm going to unmute microphones for everyone, and people can just unmute themselves in sort of and ask questions.
So we see 3 people who can ask questions. I already asked questions. So if no one wants to ask a question, then we will just thank Peter. And it was so great to see you again, and I hope to see you soon in person.
Yeah.
And we'll just climb that volcano again. Peter lives right in, there is a volcano right in his backyard, which not everyone can brag about that.
Live under the volcano, right. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Peter. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.